Lawyers, what is the most morally challenging case that you've worked on? I represented creditors in foreclosures/evictions/ejectments. Overall it made sense to me. If you can't make payments on the home or pay rent, then we would have to start the process as needed, but not all cases were the same. At some point I ended up with cases that involved specifically deceased mortgagors or occupants, with a few that had ended their own lives within the home. A lot of these people who don't have the funds to pay their mortgage or rent also can't really afford to hire their own attorney, so basically I'd be the only attorney they'd speak with. I'd provide a disclaimer that I wasn't their heirs or survivors attorney, I was the attorney for the bank, but overall most people just wanted someone to talk to about it, how they found the deceased, how they can't clean it up, how they can't afford the house they lived in 30 plus years after funeral costs, etc. It got very depressing very quickly. I was fresh out of uni and the office I worked at had this potential client who was getting charged with raping his daughter, minor at the time of the alleged fact. This man cried in front of us, denying it, saying that his ex-wife was conspiring against him, alienating his daughter and pressing false charges. At the time I was dumb. I was very, very dumb, and I had just finished reading Código de Vida, a biography of one of our ex-minister of justice in which he told a story of a very similar case, a mother making false claims of rape against the father, and ever forcing the kids to lie about it, so I voted yes to accept the client, and we did. We made the defense and claimed not guilty. Of course, the client, who was an old man by the way, assured us that he was innocent, and the facts had happened some years prior, so no DNA, no video/photo, no nothing, just witness and the victim. Court date goes on, the victim was called to testify. She was 20 years old at the time of this, and was testifying without the knowing her father were there outside the room. My colleague decided to confront her about it, and ask if she would be able to look in her father's eyes, who was standing out there, and repeat what she was saying. This girl started to immediately cry and shake at the mere thought of facing her father, repeating frenetically that she wanted nothing with that monster. I felt like a monster too. I felt wrong, and worse, mine was the vote that made us accept that man as our client, so in a way it was my fault that we were at that situation. I know that we are supposed to defend wrong people, and as an intern I had my share of scum, cargo robbers, drug dealers, a murderer, but that felt worse, way worse. Till this day I've never accepted another sex crime case, not that he got many after that. If it makes you feel better, even if your vote was why he became your client in specific, if it wasn't you representing him it'd be someone else who cared less or was strapped enough. The daughter likely still would have been in that position no matter who was representing him. Yeah, it was some years ago. Sometimes I think on this case and how I was naive and deceived by the client. In the end he was convicted at first instance of rape of vulnerable, his daughter at less than 14 at the time, plus the aggravating fact of being the father. He could still appeal, but since our contract only covered until the first instance sentence I informed my lack of will to sign a new contract for the second instance. He told me to go to the bitch who gave birth to me, saying he was going to burn my reputation. Never heard of him again. I represented a mom in a custody case. Both parents fighting for primary. Mom was admittedly a mess and suffering from some mental health issues. Dad took the kid and didn't bring them back for a few months in violation of the order. I got the kid back. Then met with mom and kid and realized kid was doing way better with dad and should be with him. Tried to reason with mom, she didn't listen. Ultimately the child protection office got involved and child was placed with dad. I last saw mom many years ago and she was still not in a super healthy place and child was still with dad. So best ending happened and not because of me. Just went through similar for my son. The judge ignored the psych evaluation saying the father was the better option and placed him with mom. I hope she keeps her shit together. Sorry to hear that. Just document, so if the situation becomes one that needs to change, you have a stack of dates, times, information, to back you up. Not me but my brother is a criminal defense attorney. He worked as a contracted public defender for a few years after starting his own business to get some guaranteed income while building his client base. The catch with these contracts is you're not able to refuse clients. He had to defend a guy that had repeatedly raped his toddler daughter while the mom watched. When I asked him about how he got through it, he said, "When I get to a point where the crime is so heinous that I can't empathize with my client, I switch my frame of thought from, how will I get this guy reduced or no time? To, how can I ensure this guy won't have a chance at a mistrial?" So essentially, he copes by making sure that everyone from the police, to the jailers, to the prosecution team are 100% on the up and up so that when this guy gets found to be guilty, there's no way he'll get set free on a technicality. I'm not a lawyer, but I was the person who reported the crime and also the primary witness. I was subpoenaed and there for the trial. I still struggle from time to time with what happened. I worked at a major electronics store. A customer brought in a laptop and asked me to back everything up to DVD. I did it, but the file names looked extremely suspect. One video was named Pedo MP4, and another was 13-year-old and Uncle.move. So, I called the cops. They showed up and took my statement and I ended up being subpoenaed as a witness. Months and months went by and I finally had to show up for court. I get there and I have to face the accused. The laptop had recently been given to the family's adopted son for his 18th birthday. A few weeks later, my report ended up getting him tried as an adult and put on a sex offender registry. He broke the law. He was in possession of seriously troubling illegal materials. But, he was still a kid. From time to time I still sit around and think about whether or not I had any other options. I don't think I did, but I still hate that I was the one that had to make the call. Please don't ask for specifics. Had a case where a guy shot and killed a security guard that slapped him across the face for selling drugs near a store. I knew the guy had done it. It was close to midnight, the crime scene had poor lighting and the shooter wore a hoodie. Only a witness that showed up for the trial had told the police at the time of the crime that the suspect was black. The defendant wasn't Caucasian but wasn't black either. That, in my opinion, was the argument that won the jury over. Defendant found not guilty. He thanks me while in tears. His mother and grandmother bring me cake and a thank you note afterwards. Less than a year later I'm watching the news and they're reporting a crime where a crew held up 3 families hostage while robbing their apartments. They beat up the janitor very bad. They tied the families up and locked them in one of the apartment's bathroom while threatening to tow a grenade inside if any of them decided to wisen up. For a brief second one of the robbers looks right into an elevator camera before spray painting it. Close up on the guy's face. I think you can imagine whose face I was looking at. Edit, to everyone asking, he was identified but never caught. Managed to stay on the run for maybe a year and a half and was later killed over some drug-related debt. My friend's dad is an attorney. He started out in criminal defense, and lucked out on one of his first cases. A friend he'd known for years' wife was horribly murdered while he was away, dismembered with an axe. Her body had been found by a fluke, and there was a tiny bit of circumstantial evidence pointing to the husband. He was an upstanding citizen, the two had never fought, it was a silly case. The lawyer got the husband acquitted, and while they were having celebratory drinks, the husband admitted he'd actually done it. My friend's dad walked out of the bar and switched to corporate law. Holy fuck, people are shit, what was he even thinking to brag that he had killed his wife? He wasn't bragging, he just felt his attorney deserved to know the truth. And due to privilege couldn't tell anyone else. Is there some sort of law that states a guy can't be arrested again for a crime that he has been acquitted for even if he confessed to someone? Double jeopardy. Once you are acquitted, you cannot be prosecuted for the same crime. I remember a movie years ago, a guy got off for killing someone when he was obviously guilty. More evidence came up after the acquittal about another murder, but too late. The bad guy was on the steps of his jet, about to flee the country. He lit a cigar with a $20 bill, and a detective arrested him for destroying legal currency. In all seriousness, you can be charged with separate crimes related to the same incident. Not a specific case, but viewing CP was pretty uncomfortable. As a defense attorney, you would go to the prosecutor's office to view the discovery files as they're prohibited from releasing it outside the office. So you go in and sit down in a small room and a legal secretary brings you the discs with the files on them. On one case, I had to view the files more than once. So imaging rolling and saying, "Hey, need to see that kids thing again, thanks." Also representing parents in juvenile where I was fighting to return kids to pretty broken homes. Most of the time it didn't bother me, but in one case I represented a dad whose baby mama had just had these adorable twins. These parents were absolute shitheads. Now, a lot of times, the foster families are one small step above the parents themselves, not people I would ever hire to babysit my kids. But in this case, the foster parents were a couple of 30-somethings who I presume couldn't have kids of their own. They would show up to court with the infant twins, and they bought them new dress clothes for each court date. So cute. They wanted to adopt the kids, should the parental rights of the bio parents be terminated, so I felt pretty bad showing up trying to get the kids returned to the dad. I left that job before the case was completed, but I assume it had a happy ending. The judge was never going to return the kids to the parents. So I like to think the couple has them now. Do you ever have a conversation with the judge in their chambers when you're like, "Look, I know these parents aren't fit, you know they're not fit." Not that bluntly. You pretty much always know what the judge thinks, but it's mostly unspoken. Most of these people are pretty much impossible to dress up. And drugs are often involved, so they're not even particularly motivated to impress the judge. Parents that actually care do well in what's known as reunification. They attend all visits with their children, display a good job parenting, get jobs, pass UAs, etc. Following through with court-ordered obligations does more than I could typically do as their attorney, unless there's a particular legal issue, which don't come up that often. In those instances, how do you defend without making it obvious you don't like the outcome of winning? I imagine it has to be incredibly tough to put on a poker face. It wasn't too difficult in this case because my client was either high on meth for court appearances, or was just himself sober, which was arguably worse. He was so blasted from drug use he could barely form sentences and sometimes refused to talk to the judge. At one point he started talking to the judge about finding his peace of mind, and I realized he was reciting the lyrics to Soul to Squeeze. I actually started laughing at court that day. So despite it being sad, it was also a little funny. And there wasn't really anything I could do to help him, so the obligations on my part were pretty low. But you're right, it was hard to keep a straight face when trying to argue on this guy's behalf. I used to do a lot of enforcement court cases, where we would use lines in properties to cover losses on loans on behalf of our clients, banks and such. Had one case, where the debtor was very eager to talk about the debt and how he really wanted to repay our client according to the agreed repayment plan, how he was trying to come up with a way to get the money, etc., etc. The meeting dragged on for an hour. These cases usually took less than 10 minutes, since the debtor very rarely had any other way of repaying the loan, and he seemed very eager to tell me about why he was in debt in the first place. I finally asked him out of curiosity why he had taken out the debt, and it turned out his son, who was around my age, had terminal cancer, and he and his wife had sold everything they owned and took out huge loans with their house as security to provide him with the best possible treatment, and eventually hospice. And, as he said it, now my son is gone but the debt is not. All I could do was warn him about the planned foreclosure 4 weeks later, if he did not find a way to repay as promised. Turned out he did find a way to come up with the money, but I still think a lot about that case. Not me but a friend who studied law. They helped on a case where the father had shot and killed the mother of his children. The reason why he had shot her was because he was working abroad to earn as much money as he possibly could for his kids, so that they would never have the life he did as a child. He came back to find that she'd spent all the money on drugs and his kids were being abused. So, how'd it end? Cause as demented as it may seem, I hope he didn't get any punishment. Sorry, don't check Reddit often and didn't expect this story to be so popular. He was on death row. My friend was part of the team trying to overthrow his death penalty sentence. I don't know what the outcome was. I've only worked as a legal intern, not a lawyer, and I cannot speak in specifics for obvious reasons, but I've dealt with about 8 child SA cases at this point. I helped prosecute most of those, but played a role in the defense on a couple. I can tell you, either which way you're working the case, it's tough. Nothing is more terrifying than reading a young victim's description of being abused at the hands of a trusted family member. I'm a lawyer now but had a somewhat similar case while an extern at the Federal Public Defender's Office. Client lived in his brother's basement for years, during which time he repeatedly abused his nephew and filmed it and posted it online. Glossing over lots of the details, but he got arrested by state authorities and the feds picked up the case. He was fucked. Feds haven't outright lost a case like this in almost 2 decades. I think bare minimum guideline range of 1,600 months, essentially a life sentence. We went to visit him and were the first contact he's had with lawyers since his arraignment. My supervisor thought this would be a good opportunity to throw me in the deep end to see how I'd interact with the new client. He literally couldn't understand what he did wrong, explaining in great detail how his nephew was often asleep during the encounter so it couldn't be a crime. When he was awake he really enjoyed it, and a bunch of other gut-wrenching rationalizations. At the time I thought this was a terrible idea, but over time I see the wisdom in my boss doing that. I've never wanted more to jump across a table and choke someone to death in my entire life, yet I had to remain completely composed and professional. He was one of the most despicable human beings I'd ever met in my life, yet our office was the only people on earth that were supposed to be on his side, advocating for and safeguarding his rights. It fucks with your head. The experience has really stuck with me, even years later. Being dispassionate in your profession is something that is really, really difficult to master. Especially when dealing with people like him. Compartmentalizing judgment and emotion doesn't come naturally to most people and it takes years of dedicated practice. Nevertheless, I still find comfort in the fact that he's be spending the rest of his life in a living hell. Family law attorney here. I've done plenty of divorces and custody dispute cases, that most stuff doesn't get to me. It's only when the kids are put in a bad situations between one or both of the parents being some type of addicts that really gets to me. One that was especially hard for me was a divorce where I represented dad. Mom was a raging alcoholic that would bring random guys home many nights from the bar while the dad was working. I saw a video and heard phone calls from their little boy calling the dad at work at like 2 a.m. because he was tired, but couldn't go to sleep because mom was playing loud music and had friends over still partying. I was on the right side of that one, but seeing and hearing that stuff with the little boy really got to me. Did the dad win custody? Oh yeah, slam dunk for him on that part. She only got supervised visits only, and sadly didn't really adhere to that either. Last I heard she moved back with family in Ohio to sober up and have surgery done on a polyp from all of the drinking. It's still sad after all that though, since the little boy stays with a close friend of the dad's at night while the dad works. Normally we would have them stay with family, but the dad didn't have any around, so he doesn't really get to see his son too much until his days off. A close relative was a judge in a pretty small town in the 80s. There was a case, drug deal gone bad. I guess one guy went to his dealer's trailer. Guy planned to rob dealer, not only take his drugs but his money as well. Dealer picked up on that plan quickly and pulled out a gun. First guy pulled out his gun as well. Both died, by stupidity, really. The families ended up suing each other for wrongful death. Relatives spent a couple of days going over the law before they arrived in court, each wanting to get rid of the other for money. Relative, while on the bench no less, said something to the effect of, they both did society a favor by removing themselves from our society. Early 80s, not a chance for that statement to go viral the way it would now, but you can bet the week following the letters to the editor in the local paper blew up. I only include this because the prosecutor was laughing so hard he had to excuse himself from the room when the judge made the comment. What prosecutor would have been there in a civil case? He was just there observing, like I said, small town. The fact that he found the comment amusing was one of the major points people wrote in their letters to the editor. During my days of insurance defense, I spent one lovely afternoon bickering with counsel for a co-defendant over who would be responsible for paying the $5,000 that was keeping us from settling. We did this while on site at the plaintiff's home for a deposition. Plaintiff was hit by a semi-truck, that is, the truck hit his actual body, on the interstate, and while it managed not to kill him, it tore off an arm and a leg, and shattered most of everything else. He was almost entirely immobile, confined to a power chair that he could barely operate, and confided to us that if he had function in his remaining hand, he'd shoot himself. Oh, the $5,000? It was based on an estimate to renovate his bathroom so that he could actually use it. He'd been pissing and shitting in a bedpan in the living room. I felt like a complete fuck sitting in front of him and arguing about such an insignificant sum. I also did some insurance defense work early in my career. Plaintiff was 375 pounds, massively obese man. He routinely traveled Southeast Asia on vacation, and would come home needing treatment for various STIs. It was pretty clear he was traveling to have relationship with minors and sex traffic victims. We get to review medical records for plaintiffs. His injury? He was walking, stepped off the curb and broke his foot, that caused him to fall, breaking his arm as he put it out to brace himself. The curb was 3 centimeters off grade, so he sued the municipality. He fell because he was too fat and pathetic to step down 15 centimeters instead of 12, and that caused 3 bones in his foot to break. In surgery he developed compartment syndrome in the leg and was now using a mobility walker to get around. He had not lost his sedentary job, and really he was headed toward the walker anyway. He was 33 years old. In discovery, on the record, he said he would settle for $200,000 because that would let him sell his house and move to the country in Southeast Asia that he liked to visit. I can't recall which one, where he could have sex whenever he wanted for only a few dollars. This was all on the discovery record. I asked if he was talking about sex workers. His lawyer objected before he could answer, which was the correct thing to do. He ranted about how he couldn't have sex in Canada because it was too difficult to make that happen. His lawyer was pissed that he said the amount on the record. Him saying too difficult to make that happen stuck in my head. Was he saying because he was so fat, or was it because of his preferences? I had represented some sex workers on criminal charges as a law student, and they only cared about whether the guy could pay, so I was left feeling like it was kids. Basically, I had to advise my client that we should settle for an amount that was going to let this fat piece of shit fly out of country to a place where he could live off the interest and molest all the children he wanted to for the remainder of his disgusting, pathetic life. The insurance company settled immediately. Edit, a lot of comments saying I am wrong for recommending to my client to settle. A lawyer's job is to obtain the best result for the client. Settling for $200K was a very good result in this case, as there was strict liability for a statutory breach by the municipality. What he did with the money, or what I suspected he would do with it, is of no relevance to the insurer or the defendant and was not part of my legal opinion, as it was only my strong suspicion and had no bearing on the case. Video editor, not a lawyer. I make lots of tapes for lawyers, harsh depositions, evidentiary stuff, getting to the good stuff in a 12-hour surveillance tape. I have even had to pixelate everyone's face but the suspects in hospital surveillance tape due to the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Sometimes the state will ask me to recover very bad audio from criminal investigations or see if I can see fraudulent editing on a tape, debunk a James O'Keefe copycat. I don't see the whole case and never know the outcomes. I just get a ton of raw input. Video can lie and so can mine. A thing I felt bad about was working for the defense in a civil suit. New worker had his legs crushed at a loading dock. We get our cameras and are working for the company to show how the loading dock is supposed to be done and all their safety equipment working. They have their best guy to demo the stuff, the old SALT employee. He can't make the safety latches work at 2 of the 3 loading docks. The one that does work doesn't work reliably. It is obvious they never use this stuff. But the video is edited and it looks like the company and safety equipment are slick and functional when run by the most seasoned pros. I was in charge of a legal aid office for domestic violence and SA survivors. I had a custody case where the father was very abusive and manipulative, and the mother, my client, had a slew of serious challenges, both as a result of the abuse and just because she lost the lottery. Mental health, physical health, financially, family circumstances, just everything. In the jurisdiction where this happened, the judge who was responsible for this case was, to put it bluntly, an abuser. The judge's way of addressing domestic violence issues, unless they fit into a very narrow band of cases the judge considered real abuse, was to abuse the victims in court until they went away. So, because I had been around the block a few times with this judge by this point, I had an ethical responsibility to prepare my client for what would happen if we filed a custody petition to go for what she wanted. Not to try to convince her what she should do, but just to be sure she understood, when she decided what she wanted to do, what to expect. Awful conversation to have, because a few things would almost certainly be true. The father would lawyer up aggressively and start making everything even more of a living hell ASAP. It would go to a trial, and every single tiny issue she had ever struggled with would be aired out in court, putting her in the worst possible light, and she would be hectored and bullied and browbeaten by the husband's lawyer and by the judge. She's a terrible mother, she was a terrible wife, dad finally couldn't carry her anymore, so she made up abuse to get him back. She doesn't work, she can't provide for herself, let alone the child, she's crazy, she's lazy, her family doesn't even believe her, just the worst, most sordid perspective on anything, and the judge would eat it up. The morally challenging part wasn't, like, should I do what I can to help this person? It was what would actually be helpful here, if I strongly suspect that going through this process will be extremely harmful to her for little or no material gain, but I also believe that I'm good at my job and want her to know I'll go in there and go ham on her behalf. Every client wants to know whether they can get what they want, but lots of clients, especially in a domestic violence setting, don't really have any sense of what is okay or fair to expect or want. Either consciously or subconsciously, lots of people are looking for a lawyer to tell them what they should do, because it's complicated and it's hard to make that call. For that reason, a lot of lawyers become comfortable saying, "No, I understand, but you don't want to do that because blah blah blah," or, "Yes, we should immediately blah blah blah," effectively making the decision for the client. But that wasn't my approach, and that kind of thinking really shouldn't be, in my opinion, anywhere near people who have experienced violence. So it fucking sucked trying to prepare a client to be able to make her own decision in an informed way when I knew, with certainty, that litigating the case would be opening the door to all kinds of abuse. Did she decide to go forward with the case? Yep. It went to a custody trial, at which Dad won literally everything he wanted. We went back on a couple petitions to modify, and then took it all the way up to an appeal in state court, which was denied, not unexpectedly, because trial court judges have lots of discretion in such cases. We won a few small victories, so it wasn't all doom and gloom, but it was a hard process. So, did the dad end up with the kid then? The father had gotten mom placed on a psychiatric hold the day she said she wanted to leave him, so the kid was with dad as of the time mom went to court. Mom was fighting to get more time than dad was allowing. The small victories I mentioned were about getting progressively closer to equal time in shared custody, and finally 50-50, but yes, the kid stayed primarily with dad for quite some time.